Well, hello everybody. I'm Shao, and today is August 2nd, 2024. I love bootstrapping, and so this video is about producing a REPL, or something akin to a REPL. That is a read, evaluate, print loop in a browser. This continues on from a previous video, 001, in which an about blank page was used to create a sort of a minimal JavaScript user interface. And so this builds upon that. Up in the top right corner, you can see a QR code. You can scan that to visit a web page where the code involved in this video will be available. All right, so let's get started here. I've got a web page which is akin to one from a previous video. What I've done though is I've added, I'm not sure whether you'll be using an old browser or a new browser, so I've got both methods available to save the page. It's handy to be able to do some work in a page and not lose that work. So a save feature is nice to have. All right, well, what have we got here? Up in the top, I've got a text area where I can type in code or paste code, and I can click this run to activate that code. Well, down further here, I'm going to review this code while you do something else. So here we start with a function expression. It's just an expression that begins with a bracket here, or a parentheses if you like, and then it's got an anonymous function, and then the function body starts after that. I do this because I don't like to pollute any scopes with the variables that I create, and so I contain it all within a function, and then I call that function. And then I avoid pollution that way. So what have we got first? We've got some eval ta underscore on keyup function. How does that go here? I make, scrolling a little too quickly, I think. Might have to use the arrow keys. I make a few variables there at the top. Code, HR, line count, and lines, and TA for text area. And the first thing that this function is going to do is it's going to fetch the text area called eval ta, whichever element on the page has that ID. And then it's going to assign to the code variable either the text property of the text area or the value property of the text area, depending on which one evaluates as a truthy value. And that's because different browsers have different strategies for how to represent the content of a text area. Then the next line there, I take the lines and make an array out of the lines of the code content by splitting them by new line, and then I take the count by looking at the array's length. And what are we doing here? This text area.rows property is going to identify sort of the height of the text area that we're working with. And I'm going to have a maximum of 7 rows. So as you're typing into a text area, as you introduce new lines, you're going to get the text area to get higher and higher up to a maximum of 7 rows. And down below that, I go and I fetch a horizontal rule element that has the ID eval HR, and then I'm going to scroll that HR into view, and then I'm going to scroll the text area into view. And the rationale here is that as you're typing into this text area, I want it to make sure that what you're typing is always visible on your screen and convenient for you to work with. So that's why I'm using the scroll into view functions. Then out, so that's the end of that on keyup function. It's going to be tied to the text area. Then I make a variable called eval on click. Now, whereas above I made a function and gave it a name, this time I'm doing things a little bit differently because, oh, I gotta get back down here. All right. This is going to be, there's going to be an eval button, and when it's clicked, I want it to execute some code, and included in that code is going to be an actual invocation of JavaScript's eval function, which is a built-in function. And I don't want the code that the user writes to be polluted with any variables or identifiers here. So I'm trying to keep everything anonymous as possible. So included in that is this eval on click function. If I was to give this function a name right to the right of the word function there, that would show up if I was taking the string representation of the function. That would appear. So I've done it differently here by making a variable called eval underscore on click and assigning an anonymous function to it. That way when I take the string content of that function, it's not going to have a name involved. It's just going to be fully anonymous. All right, and then down here, what is this business here? So now we're in the function body of the anonymous function. This is beginning an expression here, this left bracket is what I call them, but I think some folks use brackets for square brackets, but I call those square brackets. And what are we doing here? This is an object, you might call it an object literal. And I'm doing that to avoid, once again, having any variables or identifiers that will pollute anything here. But inside, it'll have a property called execute, and that'll be a function, an anonymous function. And what I've done here with this v argument is it's just a shortcut. Instead of having a longer code with all my variable declarations scattered throughout the code, and for the purposes of introspection or reflection, if you like, I'm going to put all of my variables into this v object, just instead of using the var keyword to make variables. That's just a sort of a way to shorten the code a little bit and get some insights in debugging a little bit more easily, perhaps. You could serialize, deserialize, etc. All right, so I make an object for that v, and then the object literal that this is part of, that's going to be the this object. So I'm going to add some properties to that object, and the first thing I do is I make a logs property of the this object, and I go and I fetch the logs div that we'll encounter later on, and then I also fetch the text area for what the code that the user has entered, just the same as in the previous function we explored a moment ago. And so I keep those in the object so that they're handy for future purposes. And then the next thing I do is I take a look at the type of the text area's text property, just the same as in the previous function. If it's not equal to undefined, then that means that I'm using a browser where text is a property of text areas. And so what I do is I capture the code content that the user has entered, and I store that to a code property of this object. And then I empty out the text area that the user had entered code into. And similarly, if this browser uses the value property of a text area, I just do the same thing for it. Then the next thing we do is we've taken the user's input, and now it's time to clear it out. So we've just cleared it out, and I'm going to reset the row count to 1 to have just a single line that somebody can start entering their next bit of code onto. And then we do something fancy here. I invoke this log function. That's a property of the object that we're inside. But you don't know what that does yet because it's a little later on. So we'll get back to that. But what I'm passing it here is a sort of identifier. I'm calling this code, and then I'm passing the code that we stored from the user. And so this will get logged, and you'll see. Next, this is the good fun part here. We store the result of this unusual looking business here. We have an expression that begins with a 0 and then a comma, and then this dot safe evaluate. And that's the end of the expression. So what does that mean? Why do that? Well, safe evaluate is a function that's a property of the this object that we'll encounter a little later on. But if I was to call this dot safe evaluate directly, then safe evaluate would have a this available to it, because when you call a function after a dot after an object, that's what you get. You get a this. But I don't want that safe evaluate function to have a this. So I'm just going to take the safe evaluate function, but instead of storing it into a temporary variable, just to call it directly, I'm using this fun trick here with the comma operator. The result of a comma expression is the rightmost sub-expression. And so that sort of extracts safe evaluate as a function without carrying along the this business with it. So the result of that expression there, the 0 comma this dot safe evaluate, is just the safe evaluate function. And then I'm passing to it the user's code as the argument. Pardon me. Next, I'm going to check the result that was just stored. And if there's a little property called thrown, pardon me, excuse me, then that means that the user's code threw an exception or an error. And so it'd be handy to deal with that and to present that as part of the REPL, or the pseudo REPL. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm taking a look at the error property of the result, and if it's not an instance of an error type, then I'm just going to log the result. Now, you could get this if you, as the user, threw directly from your code, through, oh, I don't know, let's say a 1, 2, 3, something like that. That wouldn't be an instance of an error, and we still want to log it as an error, though. Well, my voice is giving out on me. That's too bad. All right, and otherwise, the results error is an instance of an error, and there's a different way that we might like to log that. So the next thing I check is that whether or not it has a stack property. Now, this isn't a standard property, maybe yet, in JavaScript, but it's widely supported by browsers and by Node.js. And so I'm checking for that property because it's handy. It usually includes a useful summary of the error that's encountered. So I'm taking a look at the type of that stack property, and if it's not undefined, that means it's available. And so then I'm going to log it as an error, and that's that. Otherwise, if there is no stack property, well, there's lots of complication involved here. For example, this old browser that we're looking at just now, this doesn't have a stack property, this browser. And so I'm going to some jumping through some hoops to try to get a useful error message here. The first thing I'll do is I'll make an array called error lines that's empty, and then I'll make an error properties variable that has the results of the keys or properties that are in the error that can be detected. And then I make a little iterator index I, and I loop through all of the properties, the keys that were in the error, and for each one, I'm going to make a temporary error property, and that's just going to be the key or the property name that we're working on in this iteration of the loop. And then what about here? I'm going to take some left and right square brackets, surround that property name, and push that into my array of error lines that I'm eventually going to present to the user. And then I just capture the value of the error property, and and I captured the type of that value of the error property. And the next thing I want to do, I'm trying to be very safe here. So the next thing I do is I take a look at the type of the error property. And if it's a string, well, then it's safe to push on to this array, because this array is just, I just want it to contain strings. Now there's a funny little quirk here. While writing this code, I encountered a bug with the browser's JavaScript engine. And it's probably very old news by now, but it was still a thrill to encounter. It was something to do with building a temporary string by starting or appending an empty string. And there's some kind of optimization there that lands you with an array element that can change later on, the next time that some scratch space is needed. Anyway, maybe I'll make a video to showcase that, maybe I won't. So we push that string. Otherwise, if the type of the error property is not a string, then we're going to try to make a string out of it. So here I have a try handler set up, and I'm making an array with the error property's value as the single element within that array, and then I'm joining it with an empty string. And this actually works around the bug that I was just mentioning a moment ago. This doesn't land in the same edge case that the bug doesn't account for, I guess. So this will try to make a string, but suppose that error property value wasn't appropriate for joining with the join function. Then we would get an error there, and that would land into this catch section. And so instead, the best that I'm going to do here is I'm just going to tell the user about the type of the error property that I couldn't figure out a string for. And so I use square brackets again, and I say that it was some kind of type value. All right, so that's the end of that little bit of if. So we've pushed the name of the error property. We've pushed the content of the error property, ideally, unless we couldn't. And then I'm going to push an empty line as well into the error lines. So there will be sections that'll have triplets of the name, the type, the name and the value, and an empty line just for the eyeballs to enjoy. And then finally, after making all of those error lines for all of the error properties, then I join them all together with new lines, and I log that as the error. And where were we here? Okay, we were handling all the different kinds of errors. There was the error with an error stack, and then there was the an error without an error stack, and now we're down in the area where there wasn't an error thrown by the user's code. So let's just report the value that their code resulted in. And so I log that as value. And then after all that, I'd like to make sure that after executing the code, the user's code, that they can start typing in more JavaScript. And so I'm scrolling in that text area into view again. Now that's the end of the execute function. So the next function that this object is going to contain is this utility function, just keys. And once again, I'm taking a shortcut here by making this v variable just by declaring it as an unused argument in the function declaration. That's just a shortcut. And keys will take an object argument, and many modern JavaScript implementations include the object.keys function, but some don't, like this browser that we're using right here in this video. It doesn't have that object keys. But if the browser or JavaScript implementation does have object keys, and if it's a function, we're just going to return the results of calling that function on the object. Otherwise, going to use the for x in y pattern here. Going to make a empty array called props, And then I'm going to make another property of this v for vars called prop, and it's going this for v.prop in object. That's going to iterate over all of the property names that are found in the object. And what am I doing? Something very simple. All I'm doing is adding them to the array called props. So then we return that array, and that's roughly the same thing as object.keys would give you. Not quite identical, but pretty close. It's sometimes the best you can do in some situations. And now we'll get down to log. Log is the interesting part here for the P in REPL, the print part. So once again, it gets passed a type of message and a message, and then once again, I'm just using v to declare it, and then setting it as an empty object here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to note the timestamp in a now variable. And then what's all this here? This looks complicated. I'm going to take an empty string, prepend it to the message that came in. This is a sort of a way to, in other languages, you might say that this is a way to cast the type of message to a string. It's just a sort of a shortcut to do that, if it's possible anyway. And then that's the result. So the result of that expression is going to be a string. And then what's all this here? I'm going to take any sequence of carriage return followed by line feed, R and N here, and all such sequences, and we're going to replace them with new lines, line feeds. And then the result of that string, with all those replacements having been performed, we're going to go and look for stray carriage returns that are not followed by line feeds, because all of those will have been replaced. And we'll replace those stray carriage returns with new lines. And then finally, after doing all of that, I'm going to take the results and search for all new lines. Now there should be only new lines present, and we're going to replace all of those with carriage returns. Well, why? Well, it's something to do with how all browsers support carriage returns as line terminators in certain contexts, such as displaying results in a text area element. So that's why I'm doing that. And then I'm going to create a paragraph element, and I'm going to set its inner text equal to this fun business here, a left square bracket, and just some unique identifier here, just so that if anyone wants to copy the entire content of the page and chop it up, process it later, they can look for this unique identifier to know that it's a line that was produced by this line of code in the log function. And what do we put that? We put that identifier there. After that, a pipe, and then we'll take the epoch time to millisecond precision with v.now.getTime, then another pipe character, and then a more pleasant human-readable date by looking at the now timestamps string, and then another pipe, and then we'll note the kind of type of message. Now, if you remember from earlier, we saw that one of the types was error, and one of the types was value, and one of the types is also code. So those are the different types that can appear here, and then a right square bracket to terminate that. And then I'm going to create a new temporary text area. Well, I shouldn't call it temporary, it'll be permanent, but it's a text area, and I'm going to set its columns to 73 because that's the width that shows up well in this browser in this video. And then I'm going to set its rows to the count of carriage returns plus 1, I guess it is. We take the log message and we split it up by carriage returns, and we count the number of lines that were present in the message. And then another thing is to set this text area's read-only property to true. it's nice to have these text areas on a page because it's convenient for going and selecting the text and being able to copy and paste it somewhere else. But it might also be useful to make these text areas read-only because they're logs. They're not something that you're supposed to change. They're history. And so that's why read-only is set to true. And then the trickiest part here to get those new lines to show up is to make a TA underscore text variable, and then to create a text node for it. So there are different kinds of nodes on a web page. You've got HTML elements, and then you've got nodes like text nodes. There's also comments and other stuff that I won't bore you with right now. But we create the text node and the constructor. In the constructor, we pass it the message that's the log message, the argument to this log function. And so that's going to create a text node containing that log message, ideally with just carriage returns in between lines. And then we append this text node to the text area, and that's how we get the content to actually appear in the text area with the new lines desirably. And then the next thing we do is there's going to be a logs div that we'll encounter a little later, and we add the paragraph that has the timestamps and the type of message, etc. And then we add the text area that was just generated. So that's the logs function. That's what that does. Now here's safe evaluate is another function for this object, and it only has a single argument here. And I've given it a sort of a random name because it could potentially be available to the user's code, and I want the user to have a full reign of all identifiers. Well, it just about can't be helped that we might have one in the worst case, and that'll be this one here, this identifier BAE 8B underscore. Inside of an evaluation, another possibility is that the arguments for this function might be available to the user's code. Well, I don't want that either. So the first thing I do is I override the arguments identifier with the value undefined. And then the next thing I do is I delete arguments, which might or might not work or behave differently in different browsers. But ideally, that would just sort of clean it up if there was something to be cleaned up. And then the user's code is unsafe, so I'm going to have a try handler here. And in it, I'm going to attempt to return an object that has a thrown property of false. This is the nice case when the user's code doesn't throw an error, and with another property called value. And then here, once again, I'm doing this tricky business where I'm taking the eval function, but I want to call it indirectly because JavaScript has this fun feature about the eval function built-in function, that if you call it directly, you get a certain kind of context for the code that's being executed, and if you call it indirectly, you get a different kind of context. So I'm calling it indirectly because I want it to execute as though the user's code was just in a script element in the browser. I want it to be in the topmost level that it can be in. And so I have to do this indirect call. And I pass it the user's code as the content. Well, if that succeeds, then this object with thrown as false is going to be returned from the safe evaluate function. But if the code throws an error, then this catch section will be encountered, and it'll return an object where thrown is set to true, and then instead of value, it's going to have an error property, and then what was thrown, the error. All right, so that's it. All those fun functions for that object. This is the end of the object here, and then that's the end of the expression that was surrounding the object, and then we're going to call .execute for that object. And that's the result of this anonymous function. That was the onClick function. So down here, what do we get to now? We make a div, and we give it an ID called eval div. And inside that div, I'm putting some HTML. I'm going to make a div with an ID of logs, and that's one that we're going to put all of our logging into. And then I make a horizontal rule to give some visual separation between the logs and this text area called eval_ta with 69 columns and one row. 69 is a little bit short, you might think, but that's because I want to leave room to the right of it, a little bit of real estate. And one row by default. And then for the on key up, I'm going to set the value of the earlier eval_ta on key up function that we explored, and I'm going to replace all instances of one or more spaces in the string representation of that function with a single space. And for the results of that, I'm going to then search for every occurrence of an ampersand and replace that with this HTML sequence. That's a ampersand AMP for ampersand, semicolon. And then I'll do the same thing. I'll replace all double quotation marks with ampersand QUOT, semicolon. And then all of that is going to be within an expression, and then I'm going to call that expression, and that's what happens for the on key up event. And then the text area will be empty. And then what's after that? To the right of that text area called eval_ta, there's going to be a button with an ID eval button. And its on click is going to be a comparable replacement, but it's going to be for this eval_on click variable, whose value is the earlier complicated function that was explored. And I'm going to do the same replacements for it, replacing one or more spaces, replacing ampersands, replacing double quotation marks. And the name of this button is going to be eval, which makes sense, hopefully. And after that, I'll put another horizontal rule so that anything after that on the page will appear below the horizontal rule. And this horizontal rule is also used for scrolling to make sure that the user's content is in view. And after setting all that HTML for that div, I finally append the div to the page. Well, okay, how about all that? All right, well, let's give it a try here. So all this stuff here, I'm going to select all of it. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to paste it in here. And just like in the previous video, we can click on this run to make something happen. So here, I've clicked on run. What happened? Let's scroll down. Scroll down. Okay, this is it down here. Here we have two horizontal rules. Well, this is the one that separates the REPL area, the eval_ta, from the logs. Well, what happens? Let's try something else. Let's try something out in it. How about the number 42? I'll tab over to the eval button. I'll press space. Oh, something happened there. I'll shift tab to get back into the eval_ta. What did we get? All right, we got this identifier here that says that indicates to us that this is a log. We've got a timestamp, epoch time with millisecond precision, a nice human readable date, and then an indicator that this is the code. Well, this shows us the code that was entered, and we can't change it, but we can select it and copy and paste it later if we want. And then the result was this value here, and it was also 42. Okay, all right. Well, what if I do 1 carriage return, 2 carriage return, 3 carriage return? What happens here? Aha, all right. So it shows that the code was just what I had entered, and then the value of that string with those carriage returns is 1, 2, 3, and they're nicely spaced out. Okay, that's good. How about 1 carriage return new line 2, carriage return new line 3. How about that? Oh, that gives the same result. That's good. All right, so all those substitutions seem to be working so far. How about 1 new line, 2 new line, 3 new line? Is all that working? Yeah, all that works out. All right. So it's nice to be able to see. Okay. What's next here? I'll just show you a little bit about how this error handling works. So here I have a pre-made example here. I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to put that in the eval text area. I'm going to paste that. Oh, I lost my spot here. Paste that here, and you'll notice how the text area grew as after I pasted these lines into it. It'll grow up to 7 lines tall. Let's see here, 33, 33. Oh, there, it must already be 7 lines long now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right. The point here is I'm going to make a new error, and I'm going to pass the string test to the constructor, and then I'm going to add a foo property to that error. That's going to be just some dummy function. And I'm also going to add a bar property, which is an object that has a property called answer. And I'm going to add a baz property, and I'm going to pass a browser native function to it, the document.getElementById function as the baz property. Then I'm going to throw this error from my code. So what happens if we evaluate that? All right, what do we get here? We take a look here. This was all that complicated error property handling here. There was a name property, and its name was error, and there's a description, and we see that that seems to be populated with what was passed to the constructor of the error, and same with message. And then down here, foo, we could get a string representation of that anonymous function, that dummy function, so that shows up nicely. But then bar was an object, and this JavaScript implementation represents that as a string with this funny kind of string. And then for the baz property, this was a browser native function, and this is the string representation we get for it. All right, so all of that has worked out. And let's find out, can we save our work and continue it later? So I'll go all the way back up to the top here. I'm going to clear this out, and then I'm using an old browser, so I'm going to use this old browser save page feature. Prompts me to save it. I'm going to give it an extension HTML. All right, hopefully that did something. Aha, here it is in my documents. Let's open that up. A warning, warning number 2, warning number 3. All right, and what do we have in this page here, jspage.html? I should be able to scroll down to the bottom, and there's all the work that we just went through, saved for the page. Well, isn't that nice? Okay, what's next here? Let's make sure that this works in a more modern web browser. So I'll get out of here, and then I'll go over to here, and I'll go to where maybe here. Yeah, that looks right. Okay, let's refresh it. Okay, nothing in here. All right. This is the same page that we were just looking at, roughly speaking. And I'm going to take all of this content here. Oh, I have to select all over here. I'm going to copy that. And see, it's copied to the clipboard. I'm going to paste it in here. Just do the same thing as was done with the old web browser. I'm going to run it. Okay, something happened. Here we got the eval TA. So does it work? 42. Oh, I have to type it in the right keyboard here. 42. And here we go. There's the log that shows what I had entered as my code. And my head's in the way. You can't quite see it unless I'm moving myself up here. And here's the value. That was the result. So once again, this seems to work all right. How about if we go up to the top, new browser prepared save page. All right, that prepared. And then I can now click this link to save the page. Page.html. I'll download it. Downloading, open. I'm going to give it a try here. So open this, and what do we get here? Scroll down to the bottom, and there are my logs. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching. Take care, everybody.